This video takes a biologist's perspective. It's about putting on some analytical spectacles to observe an environment. We're going to take the environment inside ourselves to create principles for why humans think as they do. So this is about psychology. And a good place to start is sex. To start with, sex is basically about successful replication. Now, successful replication is difficult because of environmental stresses, but this is fine because adaptation to stresses also increases the chances of long-term survival for new replicants. Now, a life form that integrates with another like itself greatly increases the chances of genetic resiliency in an ever-changing environment. It increases the long-term chances of the life form survival over many, many generations. So basically, the sexes are genetic information for survival and reproductive success. Now let's examine the fact that there are two sexes and how differences in the behaviour of the sexes actually lowers the species' long-term survival odds. For instance, if one sex guards the new replicant against stresses from the outside environment, and the other sex guards against domestic problems arising, then we get parenting. This cooperative role-playing behaviour is a kind of genetic code. This is the basis of differences in the psychologies of the sexes. So we start to see different types of psychology emerging, that is, different drives and attitudes. Now, the drive to find food, have sex, and find shelter is common to all, but the sex part differs. The male has to go looking for a mate, fight off rivals, and overwhelm and capture a female. His psychology is much more about action, self-confidence, taking risks, persevering, being aggressive and competitive, showing off, and dominating. They're more natural for the male to have these traits than for the females. By contrast, the female's life is relatively inactive. She also goes looking for food, shelter, and sex, but has an easier life apart from running away from some males. And when she is captured by whoever overwhelms her, she also has to look for more food than usual, but that's about it. So her psychology is more about avoiding danger, submitting to others to avoid conflict, being suggestible to male displays of what appears to her to be greatness, and being much more concerned about bodily needs. So the basic psychology is true generally for most animals. And even at this very basic level, we can see feminine and masculine psychology. But in part 2, we'll see what happens to these basic differences when complex organisms live in huge social groups. I hope you'll find this interesting. Part 2 still assumes the perspective of a biologist. It's a unique type of biologist. It doesn't keep things at an impersonal distance. It remains at all times as logical as possible, while edging ever closer to an understanding of psychology. Earlier, we looked at basic psychological differences between the sexes and how they helped a species to survive better. This video moves us further along the evolutionary timeline to look at what happens when complex organisms live in big social groups, say upwards of 1,000 members. Huge groups provide much greater protection and, for most, easier access to food and mates. But the bigger the group, the more ordered it must be. So the struggle to find food, mates and shelter becomes a struggle for access rights, that is, competition by ranking. This is essentially a free trade or open market system where the majority of animals get the benefits of being in the big group, but it also means fighting. Every member wants food, shelter and mates for themselves and their hangers-on, but the sexes fight for access rights differently. The reason for this is because big group structures support females. Where females bear the young, That is, in most of the big groups, the females are the overwhelming majority. Offspring care puts them in greater need of protection and easier access to food. So the females benefit directly from big groups the most. It is also easier for the males to locate females when it is time to mate, but the males are not usually integrated into the big group for most species. The males roam in packs or cope alone outside the big group, and their male psychology naturally positions these outsider packs to defend the big group of females and offspring as a whole. So here we see something very interesting about differences in the psychologies of the sexes. Females are the precious ones who are basically guaranteed protection by the big group as they are without needing to be active or conspicuous. Males, by contrast, are the relatively worthless ones who are not guaranteed protection by the big group but must strive to prove their value, defeat males, rivals, in order to gain mating rights. In the human species and in some ape species, males live within the big group. However, females are still the core focus of the society because humanity is anthropocentric and the human-making industry has women for its central focus. That is, women are naturally positioned to care for the young. So women are still generally guaranteed protection by the big group, and men are still required to prove their worth. And this has clear ramifications for how the ego develops in the sexes. Most females are more timid, but they are also more readily satisfied with themselves. And the males are not as jumpy, as easily frightened, but they're more insecure because they must fight more to dominate their environment. We could also say that male fighting is more overt, but in reality, males do have to struggle more. They have to do more, and this is forced onto them by the demands of society. And by society, I mean the females. The next video will be a detailed exploration of feminine psychology, but the conclusion of this video is still a minute or so away because there's something important to say in relation to the psychology of the sexes. That is, I'd like to indicate the bigger picture of this series. This is what the discerning biologist/thinker has already perceived. We've so far been looking at the sexes as social creatures. That is, the perspective has been on the needs of the species. We haven't been looking at the individuals involved. We haven't yet examined the ramifications of these psychological differences between males and females by relating it to the biologist who is observing so quietly. In animal psychology, males are not at ease with themselves. The females tend to be more timid, but the males tend to be on alert for attention and signs of submission or threat. They feel the need to show off, be noticed, and be something. And in the human species, this solidifies into a deep, habitual internal conflict in males who believe themselves to be unworthy and suspicious in some sense. It's the source of a lot of suffering, and yet this internal conflict is a rather special thing. Coping privately and silently with internal conflict without the need to express it or get rid of it somehow means men are capable of overcoming huge odds. They are capable of persevering through difficult problems, capable of inventing reliable tools and technologies through careful, consistent tests, capable of resisting criticism from a majority, capable of terrible crimes as well as laborious works of genius. And most important of all, they are capable of reason, which comes of this internalized doubting and questioning. So the fragile but huge ego of the human male is their potential for philosophical greatness. Not that this potential eventuates for most males, but the potential is at least there. There is a way to expound these differences in psychology which I think would interest many viewers. That is, I'll now examine feminine psychology by contrasting feminine women with masculine women. That will be the content of the third part of this series. Thanks for your attention, and I hope you stick around for part 3. The biologist/thinker who is observing the data streaming into consciousness does so directly. There's no peeping outside this data stream. So the question may arise, if a person cannot see beyond their own consciousness, how can they discern the influence of their own psychology? I answer, look at the observer's perspective. Can you see how consciousness focuses? Look at what it lingers on, what it selects, what it ignores. Listen to the accompanying commentary. How your thoughts interpret and identify. What the thoughts define things as. What the thoughts prefer to define things as. Those strong feelings of identities that feel right, those habitual biases. And note, too, that the observer's perspective there only implies an observer. Stepping back into a second observer's perspective like this is arguably the most basic trait distinguishing masculine from feminine consciousness. That is, feminine-minded persons cannot maintain the double observer's perspective consistently. They use the single observer's perspective without seeing the second or the third. Now, before anyone gets angry and accuses me of glorifying men, I have criticisms to make of both males and females. Remember in the previous video where I described how masculine and feminine psychology evolved? The first point is how males are the defenders, compelled to protect women and offspring from attack. This is an important point, for if we are to understand the sexes, this protective compulsion on the part of males is a hindrance. We need freedom of thought to observe and to analyse. Preventing critique of the feminine is male chauvinism. It obstructs rationality in arguably the most important area for human consciousness to think about. The second point is a deepening of the last point I made in the previous video about the internal conflict in men. It's about the relationship between psychology and consciousness. Now, women's position as carers of offspring generally instills in them the desire to avoid aggression, to accept the system, to go with the flow, and to be more trusting and to take things at face value. My criticism is that the feminine-minded individual tends not to challenge, but to settle comfortably within the illusion of the observer's perspective. She becomes mesmerized by its cinematic appeal, surround sound and sensual messages. If she is really unhappy with the situation, she only questions the content, not the mechanisms of consciousness itself. By contrast, male psychology has never been one with society. This is reinforced at a very early age when male babies are not permitted to bond with a mother as female babies typically are. They are pushed away. At this early stage, mother is the core of his life, the core of his welfare, but he's not permitted to have it. So the male must live with two systems. He must sustain two perspectives. Thus, the adult male tends to have the second observer's perspective, or in exceptional cases of extreme masculinity, to live with a third observer, which is an intensification of the second. So the feminine consciousness is more shallow in its mental perceptions than the masculine. But, before anyone gets angry about this apparently polar opposition, I'll illustrate what I mean. Genetic resiliency over the long term in sexed species relies on adaptation to the environment. In harsher environments, the sex roles have to be more masculine, meaning more unrelenting and brutal in how they manage threats to the big group's survival. For instance, babies may be instinctively at ease with being wrapped tightly in furs or be untroubled when left alone for long periods of time. Females are more masculine in such conditions, though not equally masculine as the males. But in more fertile, comfortable environments, when major predators and rival groups are controlled, the sex roles relax and both become more feminine, though still not equally so. They both tend to think less about the future, live from moment to moment, become parochial, and lead passive, vegetable-like lives. For instance, babies may be trained to entertain parents and other adults. This simple illustration shows that females can be masculine and males can be feminine, but the overall dichotomy is that masculinity predominates in males and femininity in females. I'd like to close this video with a comparison of feminine and masculine females. Here are some quotes from masculine females about feminine females. That's the method of comparison. And it shows the ability to step back into the second observer's perspective, and the ability to know the feminine as what is normal for women. We'll start with Esther Villar. Women let men work for them, think for them, and take on their responsibilities. In fact, they exploit them. Men have been trained and conditioned by women, not unlike the way Pavlov conditioned his dogs, into becoming their slaves. As compensation for their labours, men are given periodic use of a woman's vagina. Someday it will dawn on man that woman does not read the wonderful books with which he has filled his libraries, and though she may well admire his marvellous works of art in museums, she herself will rarely create, only copy. Next, Camille Paglia. Women have been discouraged from genres such as sculpture that require studio training or expensive materials. But in philosophy, mathematics and poetry, the only materials are pen and paper. Male conspiracy cannot explain all female failures. I'm convinced that, even without restrictions, there still would have been no female Pascal, Milton or Kant. Genius is not checked by social obstacles it will overcome. Men's egotism, so disgusting in the talentless, is the source of their greatness. Next, Celia Green. It cannot be said that the movement known as the women's liberation shows any real recognition of the conditions actually necessary for any sort of genuinely intellectual activity. What appears to be the issue is that it is recognised that the position of man has not, in the changing social situation, deteriorated as radically as that of women, and the solution envisaged appears to be to see that it does. The women concerned appear determined to demonstrate as thoroughly as possible their identification with precisely those attitudes which have always prevented women from achieving anything. And Valerie Solanas. No, women don't just adore being brood mares, despite what the mass of robot brainwashed women will say.
If you take everything that a woman holds dear away from her, if you take away the kids, the husband, her clothes, her home, everything.
Career.
Okay. Career, yes, this is right, her education, all these things away from her, what have you got? Nothing. If you do the same to a man, if you take away his career, his car, whatever, he's still a man. There's still a man there. So it comes down to, what exactly you're looking at. When you look at a woman, what is she? Now, is there something inside there, like a personality, a character, or is she just the stuff that she lives through, like the husband and the kids and her lifestyle and career, whatever it may be? Feminism has no purpose, no goals. Like I say, it's at bottom a variation on the same theme. So what you're seeing, you've observed that there's new faces in feminism, new colours, new designs, new patterns, new fashion. Well, there's a lot of things wrong with changing your mind every day if you actually are a person who values something.
Women display unconsciousness in the way they lack internalised persistent values and in their go-with-the-flow behaviour that is driven by emotions, sensations and anything in their environment. An atheist knows for certain that a personal, eternal God is impossible. Furthermore, an atheist does not worship any gods, including woman. Please note that none of these quotes demonstrated the third observer's perspective. The last video will explain what wise misogyny is, which, as yet, has been pointed to only tentatively. Here's 5 points for you to examine. Number 1. This video is about non-attachment. And a branch of non-attachment is wise misogyny. is not about emotional detachment. It's not about disassociation either. Third point, non-attachment is a philosophical concept. It happens from understanding the true nature of all things, what is ultimately true for things. Number 4, non-attachment is the direct outcome of rational enlightenment. Number 5, thinking logically is vital to rational enlightenment. Now let's just do a quick revision. The evolution of sexes, of different tribes, males as defenders of and providers for women and children, the masculine psychology of being the outsider, and sustaining a dual perspective of things. Now you may well ask, what's the outsider perspective got to do with non-attachment? The answer is to do with an analysis of the self. Remember how I spoke about the observer perspective, the first one, the second one, and the third? Well, I'm going to do an analysis of that to show how the masculine psychology has a closer relationship to philosophy and to rational enlightenment. This diagram by Ludwig Wittgenstein is helpful in that it can indicate for us the first observer's perspective. As Wittgenstein noted, this is not actually the case, but it indicates a lower kind of level of consciousness in that it shows the belief that there is an I, the organ of vision, that is the source of vision. Now, this isn't the case. The I actually appears within vision as a concept of the source of what is appearing. So I wish to use this device in examining the first observer's perspective in relation to the self. That is, the same first observer's perspective imagines that there is a self or I that is generating consciousness, the thoughts, emotions, imagination, values, and so forth. Now, this is not really the case, because the I and all its components actually appears within consciousness. So again, it is not as is believed that a self is actually there generating consciousness. It is not as Descartes postulated that because of thoughts there is a self. On the contrary, the self is itself a thought. To put it simply, there is no agent of self that is producing thoughts and experience. There is just what appears, which nevertheless is real and exists, but it isn't the source of consciousness. What is the source is beyond consciousness. And no matter what form or image we give to such a source, we can't actually say that that's the case. We cannot actually imagine anything as the source of consciousness. As one sage put it, we're all like empty boats without any drivers, pushed by thoughts and decisions. So this brings us back rather neatly to non-attachment. For when a person realises that all they experience, their identity, passions, values, is all a construct of consciousness, they tend to lose their attachment to it all. It becomes something like a magician's trick, nothing to get too worried about. Now, at the beginning of this video, I mentioned that wise misogyny is a branch of non-attachment. Now, how this plays out should be fairly obvious, is that when a person is aware that the constructs of their consciousness, their experiences, the loves, thoughts, ideas, their entire identity is rather like a mirage, then their obsessive interest in maintaining the interests of such a self becomes really rather ludicrous. And yet we find that that's rather what women specialise at, however unconsciously. So I just want to add again that just as non-attachment is not about an emotional dissatisfaction or psychological disassociation, in the same way, wise misogyny is not about hatred of women. It's not an emotional dissatisfaction or revulsion. It's not distaste. It's basically just a rational conclusion and a rejection of what makes up the feminine mind. So thank you for listening, and if you have any comments or questions or would like to discuss this further, I welcome your feedback.